And welcome back for another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I am your host, Tommy Jaggi, joined as always, Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. Hope everybody's having a great day. We are back after having a week off last week. I
Mhm.
had some power outages from some
Yeah,
storms up
a
here.
lot of people were dealing with that, honestly, it felt like. I had the same thing happen, but after the show would have gone live, so
We actually lost internet, Shane, for a 2-day stretch, and I had to work at my in-laws' house, and
yeah.
so not an ideal situation, but we're back and we're
Mhm.
in business now. So we're going to talk some Steelers football today. Obviously, draft is just around the corner. We've got 3 weeks until that. We're going to cover some news this morning, and then we're going to do a deep dive into some of the positions the Steelers have been targeting heavily so far. We know what their targets are essentially at this point. We can at least start to narrow them down because pro days are wrapping up here. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to close today with a list of 5 players I believe, and I want to get your opinion on this, Shane, but 5 players I believe the Steelers should not spend the 17th pick on that are technically on their radar. So let's kick things off. Let's talk about the Keanu Neal signing. Shane, we've covered pretty much everything else the Steelers have done up until these last couple signings here. So I want to get your thoughts on this. I know that obviously some fans were upset when Terrell Edmunds was signed away by the Philadelphia Eagles. They're like, oh, Steelers could have matched that price. And it wasn't very expensive. I mean, at the price of like $2.5 million, sounded like Edmunds wanted a fresh start. Maybe the Steelers did too. This guy just didn't take the ball away. And so that's something that they might be valuing a little bit more. So what are your thoughts on Keanu Neal here? I know that he hasn't quite been that same player. I believe it was 2018, 2019, he missed like all but like 4
Yeah,
games.
he was dealing
So
with some major injuries, yeah.
he's had some pretty major injuries in the past, most recently with the Bucks, and I thought he was all right last year. What do you make of this signing?
The whole thing with Edmonds is kind of the thing I question a little bit because this clearly is more of a, like, Band-Aid move to replace what he brought. Ideally, like, that's what I think they're looking at with this, and it makes sense from that perspective.
Mhm.
But when you consider the fact that the contracts are almost identical in terms of per year, he's getting 2 years, I think 4.75 million, I think is what it came out to be.
4.25?
Something
Something like
around there,
that.
yeah,
Yes.
some around a similar amount of money per year, though. It does feel more and more like Edmonds and the team kinda just felt like it was best to part ways, and the fact that Edmonds still
Mhm.
only got that much money, I know he doesn't take the ball away, but he's an athletic guy, he can play in the box a lot, he can cover pretty well, especially compared to early in his career. I think that the Neal signing is fine, considering we needed somebody, and it kinda eliminates the need to draft somebody to fill that spot this year. But it's still something they need to look into for the future to play next to Minka because he's not that young either. I think he's gonna be entering 29 or 30 this year.
Mhm.
Sign him to 2 years. Neal's up there too. Like, they don't have a long-term solution at that position next to Minka, but between those 2, they should get enough good play out of the both of them.
Yeah, I think that's the plan if I had to guess right now.
Yeah.
And as much as people want the Steelers to kind of go that safety route early in the draft, I don't think that they've expressed enough interest in
No.
that. And it kind of makes sense for what they have right here. I know that Edmonds played a lot, and the guy, I think honestly, Shane, his best trait was the guy didn't get injured. I
Yeah,
mean, he
he
missed
was
like
always out there.
2
Yeah.
games in 5 years, and he
Yeah.
played all the time outside of that. The problem is you had just a few picks in that entire span, 79 games or something around that
Right around there,
nature
yeah.
there. And then the fact that he just wasn't a splash play player.
No.
Now I'm not knocking Edmonds. I wanted the Steelers to keep him for that
Me too.
price.
Yeah, me
I
too.
thought it was good, and it's a guy that you can put down in the box. You can play a little bit of linebacker if you want him to at kind of this stage in his career and what the Steelers kind of need right now. I'm okay with the Keanu Neal signing, and again, I think it's nothing special. The collection of Neal and KZ opposite of Minka, I think should be fine. I think that
Yeah, it
the
should work, yeah.
KZ, I think that KZ is going to play more, and I think he probably should because he's the better cover guy. But if you want to go and throw a guy down into the box there, he's got some linebacker experience.
Yeah.
He can really come up and thump you in the hole if that's what you ask him to do. And so both KZ and Neal turned 30 years old this summer, I believe. And so you're
Yeah.
not getting the most youthful back end there next to Minka, but again, you got Minka. And so I don't think that you need an elite player next to him. I think it's going to be
No.
good because of that. So I think that they're going to complement each other's skill sets well. I'm good with that signing. I like it for the money. I don't know. I didn't actually see how it was structured yet because the deal just officially came out today that we saw the money.
Mhm.
Um, But yeah, I'm good with that. It covers the depth and it gives Steelers,
Yeah.
again, a little bit of flexibility as we enter the draft year. And that's what we had last year when the Steelers signed Edmonds 3 days before the draft. And everybody's like,
Yeah.
oh, Steelers are going to take a safety in the first round, which is, again, my thoughts on that. I'm very opposed to doing that because it's not a high priority position. It's not a money position. And so I don't like to do that, especially when you see the guys that are floating around in free agency, like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, the guys that you can get on very reasonable deals who can take the ball away and do a lot of things for your defense. So I'm good with the Neal signing. Add some depth there. Let's talk about Braden Fuhoku. This one, Shane, I mean, it is what it is signing. That's kind of how I feel about it. You're getting some depth at the bottom of your roster. I'm not certain that Fuhoku is going to make the final roster for the Steelers. I think it's just kind of one of those signings where it's like, if he does, then that's fine. Maybe he'll be part of a smaller rotation at the nose tackle there. In my mind, Shane, he's kind of like an undersized nose tackle, if you will, who's known for defending the run, but is not particularly great at it. And so he gives you nothing as a pass rusher. So if you're looking for a guy that's going to come and be Javon Hargrave, that's not the type of player you're getting at all. So what are your thoughts on the Fuhoku signing?
I think I want to start just by mentioning something I think is kind of funny that we're talking about him is the fact that we're commenting on his play is something that he would reject, because if you didn't see this, a while back now, he blew up on Twitter a little bit for saying that basically anybody who didn't play professional football is not allowed to talk about players or football. And obviously that opinion is something that's come up by certain people in the past and always gets kind of trashed by most people. So I think that's kind of funny that we're talking about him. But again, I kind of agree. To me, if he makes the roster, it's just because we didn't address it in the draft early enough for someone to be ready to come in and play. They looked at what they had last year at the defensive line, especially the depth, and just don't like it. And I agree with that. So, taking a flyer on a guy for a year, I don't care about it. It's not like it's a big deal. I do expect, though, that if they draft at least one guy that's actually ready to go in and contribute, he probably doesn't make the team. And that's just, again, he's not the type of player that you have to keep or anything like that. He played for the Chargers, who weren't good at stopping the run, and that's kind of what only thing he might be able to do. So it's whatever, honestly, in my opinion. So.
Exactly. And Braden, if you end up watching this, you're much better than Shane.
For sure. No question about that whatsoever.
What we have to do, and we have to be objective here, Shane, and we take a lot of heat for this because it's just part of the business, but we have to grade Fuhoku in comparison to other players at the NFL at his position.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at other players on other teams and how they've performed, Fuhoku just doesn't measure up very well from what we've seen so far. That's not to say that he couldn't take a step up.
He could.
This year.
I hope he does. Really
but what my view of him is, I think he's kind of one of those bottom of the roster type players, and we'll see if he sticks around through the summer and maybe he'll land on the final roster here. And did they cut the roster down? It's just one roster move, right?
So now we will have one big old cut day.
Okay. So that's going to take all. Yeah, we're going to get all the drama all at once, and we'll see if he cracks that group there.
Yeah.
Steelers hired a new offensive assistant coach today, Glenn Thomas. As soon as Matt Canada, it was announced that he was returning to be the offensive coordinator for the third straight season after the Steelers scored 18.1 points per game. Fans are about to lose their mind. And I understand that. I mean, I know that things got better in the second half of the season, but again, you can kind of point to strength of schedule, maybe a little bit of Pickett's development. I think Pickett bailed him out in some ways with those two game-winning drives against the Ravens and the Raiders there. So if not for that, it makes you wonder, like, would the Steelers said, yeah, you're done. We didn't get to a 500 record. So I don't know. I mean, again, it's hard to understand some of this. I think the biggest thing that we agreed on, Shane, was the Steelers didn't want to have to undergo a coordinator change in the second year of Kenny Pickett. And so they're kind of sticking with that. I'm hoping that Glenn Thomas provides something. I mean, he's kind of bounced around everywhere. Falcons, Temple, UNLV, and then he was with Baylor and Arizona State. And so he's had some really good success. He's had some pretty bad years with some of those teams. I haven't studied him enough to know at this point in time. So, and this just happened today. What do you make of this sign? Do you think that he could potentially maybe work to save Canada's job?
See, I think the thing with this that I look at, I go, this is a guy who's an experienced offensive guy. He's helped a lot of quarterbacks. He's shown, the ability to help quarterbacks be better at certain situations. Now, obviously, the most recent track record, Arizona State was kind of a mess. I'm not the biggest Arizona State follower, obviously, but I know enough about that situation. It was just a mess. The whole program is kind of up in flames right now. So that I have a hard time judging, how much of that he has anything to do with, but he's had success at the NFL level with, being an offensive guy. So I'm hoping that at the very least he can help work with Pickett, or he can bring something to the group. It's just nice to see them address something though offensively, because you can't leave Canada just up to his own devices at this point to come up with stuff. And I understand, and we talked about it when it happened, obviously, but I understand the concept of like, you don't want to have a young quarterback go through an entire scheme change after just his rookie season. However, if the scheme isn't good, does it matter? That's the question that you have to ask. But again, I'm hoping that it's I don't think it's going to save Canada's job, other than unless he scores 25 plus points a game and we win like 12 games. I don't think he's back otherwise, right?
Mhm.
His expiring contract, they don't have to keep him past this year. They can let him go with no repercussions or paying or whatever else. That still feels very likely, and that's what I'm hoping does happen, admittedly. But if the right people can be around Canada and influence him in the right ways, and maybe you can get him to the point where he is a good coordinator, then that's awesome. But I'm just not banking on it, basically. So
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there. There needs to be a significant step up, and I
yes,
think the Steelers
huge
know that at
difference.
this
Yeah,
point. And again, we can go look back at and we say, I mean, it can get worse. When we say
it
it can't
can.
get
Yeah,
worse, it can get worse because when
it
we had
can. Yeah,
Randy Fichtner as a Steelers offensive coordinator, Pittsburgh scored 26 points a game. Last year it was 18.1. I mean, it
yeah.
was just bad. It was really, really bad. Regardless of what you thought the improvements were or weren't in the second half of the season, it can get worse. And so I think we've seen that with Canada. Knowing that, I don't know if it can get much worse than it was last year. And so that's why I
Probably
think
not.
that this is it. I mean, he's got to, you got to take a step up. And if you would put a number on it, Shane, like let's just, I mean, there's so many stats that go into this, just like points per game the Steelers score. What is that breaking point? Steelers are like, I can't bring you back for this, or I will bring you back if you score X amount.
I think if they score 25 points a game, I think that there's a reasonable chance that he returns in some capacity.
I think
Maybe it's
there's a
like a
conversation
yeah,
there.
I think it's
Yeah.
maybe a 2-year, like nothing crazy, but I think there's a chance, like especially if, and I think this is the key thing. You can tell by the way the offensive moves that they've made in the offseason so far in free agency, and what we kind of
Mhm.
expect them to do in the drafted offense too. They are leaning into the one thing he has done okay at, which is call a run game, right? They're leaning
Yeah.
into that. And I think with a young quarterback with a really good defense, that makes a lot of sense regardless of who the coordinator is. But specifically for Canada, if you want him to be successful, it's got to be with a run focused game plan. And you hope
Mhm.
that the passing game, he can let Kenny kind of handle more of that himself in his second season. And then you might see improvement just based on that alone, honestly. That might be enough to get him there where you could think about it. But I think if they don't score 20 plus points, there's absolutely zero shot that he comes back. It doesn't matter how good or bad they actually look. If the
Mhm.
offense isn't scoring 20 plus points, he's not coming back. And I honestly think that's unfortunately what we're probably in line to see.
Yeah, I would say that's certainly fair. Let's get this chat going, guys. If you have any
Yeah,
questions for us, please drop
absolutely.
them in here. Or if you just
Yeah.
want to comment on something that we're saying, you agree,
Yeah.
disagree, whatever, go ahead and feel free to chat on YouTube. NFL Pro Days wrapped up, Shane, or wrapping up, I should say. I think
Hmm.
Alabama's second pro day is tomorrow,
Yeah.
and then
Hmm.
that's basically it.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I think we know what we're going to know for the most part at this point
For
when
the
it
most
comes to
part.
the
Yeah.
Steelers. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So we're going to brush over this one. We'll talk about the positions they're targeting most. I just wanted to throw that out there that this is it. I mean, it was a busy pro day trail for Tomlin and Khan. Not as busy as it was this past year, I don't think, when the Steelers were adamant about drafting that
Yes.
quarterback
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
first round. And
Yeah.
so we don't know if every trend is going to stick around like we've
Hmm.
seen all these past years when it comes to the pro day visits. That needs to
Hmm.
be a box that's checked. The
Right.
dinner meetings, how much goes into that. But it's worth visiting, and we're going to talk about some of those things. I'll have that full breakdown in the near future here. I've already been compiling a chart, putting
Hmm.
everything together. So we'll talk about those visits, and we'll discuss them more coming up here. So Steelers have used 21 of their 30 pre-draft visits, Shane. Um, any names on that list that kind of surprise you in terms of what the Steelers have chosen to do there?
I know that unless I was reading it wrong, I know that I think we have Emmanuel Forbes coming in. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that one does surprise me, and it's not necessarily because I think he's a bad player, but his size is a bit of a concern,
It's scary.
it's and I like the player overall. I think that he doesn't probably fit what we're looking for at corner, at least based on how we've been playing coverage the past couple of years. But again, I wonder, like, do they view him as maybe just like a slot only player, which I don't really know if I like that because of his like, even though the size is, I guess, a little bit less of a concern, especially if you take him off the field on, not obvious passing downs, but obvious rushing downs, like you can kind of get away with that. But I also don't know where his draft value is at this point because I think prior to his weigh-in, he was looking more like a second round player. That weight might push him down a round or two. It just might. Like, it's just really hard to look at a guy
so
that
concerning,
big.
Shane, because even if he showed up at 180,
It was still skinny.
It's still outlier size for a person with his frame, especially. But being 166 is tiny. I don't know what you can do in an NFL weight program. I hope that you can get him up to the 180-ish, 185 range, and you can have maybe like a Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie type build, because he is a phenomenal player. Like, if you go put on the Forbes tape, man, I love that guy. I need him to be heavier because he's a 0 percentile guy right now. He's one of the biggest outliers we've ever seen before at the cornerback position. Now, the length is there. He's got 96 percentile length. He's got 4.35 speed. He had the 14 picks in college. I'm a huge Forbes fan.
Yes.
If Forbes was 185, he's probably my CB1 in this class. Like, I think he's that good. He would be up there with Christian Gonzalez if we're just looking at the tape. We got some questions dropping in here, and I love to see that. Odds of Richardson falling to day 2, 0. I'm sorry. I think that as much as that would be fun to be able to be like, oh man, we can get Kenny Pickett's backup plan right here. I think Richardson's going in the top 5 if I had to guess.
Yes.
And, he's just too talented. I mean, we compare him to a prospect like Malik Willis last year that the Steelers fans were kind of totally different. We're talking about a more athletic guy in a bigger frame who played in the SEC, who didn't have to transfer, who wasn't as shaky, even though both of them have lots of work to do in the passing game. I think Richardson, in comparison, is immensely more talented than any quarterback in last year's class. And honestly, we're just going by physical gifts. He's one of the most talented quarterback prospects we've ever seen. What can you get out of that?
Yeah, physical gifts wise, he is a one-of-one athlete at the position when you factor in size, especially, right? And I think the thing that people have to think about with him is the thing that a lot of, especially casual fans or even serious fans in the NFL, they look at his profile as a college player, and he completed 53% of his passes in his only season he really started games, right? That is really rough to look at. But you have to remember, Florida's offense, not very good in general, right? And a lot of his attempts were down the field, more aggressive throws, and you're just not going to complete as many of those passes, regardless of how good your offense is. You're going to have a lower percentage of throws hit in that situation. So they asked a lot of him down the field, and obviously he was the greatest runner. We all know that. But I think he does more NFL things than Malik Willis ever did in college, and that's a big thing too. He has a ways to go, I think, to being like able to really run an offense fully on his own, but he's not nearly as far away as I think Willis was coming out. So you have to remember that too. And that factors into the evaluation, because if you can take this guy, in the top 5 and you can sit him, especially for a year, he's one guy I would obviously want to see him sit for a year. He might only need to sit though for a year and he might be ready to go. Like, that's kind of where I view him at. So his floor, I would say probably the 6th pick to the Lions. If Willis goes at 4 instead of him or something like that. But even then, I don't see him getting outside of that top 6. So,
yeah. And I know, man, the Kenny Pickett haters would absolutely love something like that. And I get it. I mean, I want to see Pickett take a big step up. Richardson's obviously way more physically gifted than Pickett. We'll see what his career path is, but he's not even coming close to sniffing the second round, I don't believe. Top 3 cornerbacks, Cash Rollins comments in here. Let's get to that one towards the end of our segment here. We're going to talk about the cornerbacks. So we'll table that one for now. And I'm going to keep going, Shane, if you want to keep reading a few of those comments. We're going to talk real briefly here before we move into our next discussion topic about Steelers mock drafts. Over the last day and a half-ish here, it looks like kind of like NFL media is narrowing in on like 2 players here. So we've got Broderick Jones, who 3 experts listed to the Steelers yesterday, and then Deontay Banks is the other one. And ironically, the Steelers just had that pre-draft visit with Deontay Banks scheduled. So, but prior to that, there didn't seem to be a lot of interest there. I believe the Steelers was a schedule conflict. Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan were at the NFL owners meeting. And so just one area scout in attendance for Maryland's pro day. But it looks like we're kind of near on 2 guys. One I'm a fan of, and the other one we can talk about later. So
we'll talk about it later.
So any thoughts on that, Shane?
I think that as far as Broderick Jones goes, it's not that I don't like it, obviously, because I think you do too, obviously. I just don't think he'll be there. And that's the question,
Yeah.
right? I think that the top 3 offensive tackles and really offensive linemen, because Skoronski, whether you view him as a tackle or guard, he's one of the top 3. It doesn't feel like they're going to be there at this point. Like there's too many teams ahead of us that really could use one of those guys. Maybe something happens where a team just pivots and they say, we're going to trade down because maybe our top guy is only one we really viewed as someone we could take at our pick or something like that. But it just doesn't feel that way at this point. I feel like 3 of them are going to go at least in the first 16 picks. And obviously we're at 17. So it's probably going to have to be a different tackle if it's going to be a tackle. So that's the only thing I'll say with Broderick Jones. Now, if he makes it there and they don't pick him, I'll be surprised again, just because he's a Georgia guy. They clearly are happy with those guys. Everybody's happy with those guys right now. He doesn't necessarily have to play immediately, but I think he would still be, even though he's a little bit raw, he'd be an upgrade over tackles regardless. So I think you could play him early if you needed to. And if you don't, who cares? Like he'll be ready next year, if not this year. So I would love that pick, but.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, agree 100%. We're going to get to some of that stuff in our next 3 episodes leading up to the NFL draft. My guy, Eric, chimes in here. He believes Thomas was hired for 2 reasons: to help Canada, also to be a fallback plan. Yeah, I think helping Canada for sure. As far as the fallback plan, Eric, we'll see. I don't know if the Steelers would try to go a little bit bigger, someone with a little bit bigger reputation, maybe,
it's hard to say
if he doesn't work out. And maybe he sticks on the staff otherwise, but definitely a good prediction there. We're going to move on to our second discussion topic. And again, we'll try to get to all your questions here as you keep putting them in the chat. Steelers draft. Let's take a look at some of the positions, Shane, that they are, looking to, at this point, target early. And again, now that pro days have essentially wrapped up, we can see where Tomlin and Khan have been. We can see the players that have gotten those visits. And so there are guys who check a lot more boxes than others. Let's go ahead and start with the offensive tackle position here, Shane, because I think there's a very good chance of this happening somehow. Yeah. And I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, because I agree with you. I do believe that Broderick Jones is probably gone by that point. I mean, you've got the Bears, Titans, and Jets all picking ahead of the Steelers. Each of them desperately needs an offensive tackle. And so it's hard to imagine him getting past there. And likewise, Paris Johnson Jr., who many expect to go even ahead of Broderick Jones. I don't see either of those 2 guys there. Peter Skoronski, Steelers haven't showed a lot of interest in. I don't think that he's a tremendous fit, especially now that they went out and signed 100 guards. And now your team is full of guards. You don't have a tackle. And Skoronski with the 32.25-inch arms, that scares me. It really scares me.
Doesn't fit the profile for them.
Yeah. No, I know that he was really good this year. Only gave up the 6 pressures this year, 26 combined over the last 2 seasons, which is a little bit concerning. Only 6 this year. But man, when you watch a guy like Lucas Van Ness get into him and just long arm him backwards, there's a reason why we call these outlierish traits outliers, because typically the threshold you're looking for there is 33-inch arms. And that is like the bare bones cut off, like Rashawn Slater. You are perfect at everything else you do. You just don't have the right frame. Skoronski coming in well short of that makes him like the 4th shortest arms ever at the position. And I'm just not okay to take a chance on that when arm length matters so much for offensive tackles. And we've seen that. You take a look at a guy like Orlando Brown with his long arms, he's able to overcome being a 7th percentile athlete. And I think that that's the case kind of as you go throughout. And obviously not every long-armed prospect is going to turn out like Braden Clark, who the Steelers signed as depth. Yeah. So that's just kind of my quick spit on him there. But I do feel like offensive tackle is a strong possibility. Either pick 17 or pick 32. And Shane, I got him pulled up right here. Paris Johnson got the pro day dinner meeting with the Steelers. So that's like a double check box. Right. Yeah. For me, that's a big one there. In order to get him, though, I believe that they would have to trade up, probably pick 49 at least, to move up a little bit higher in the draft. Do you see any way that this one plays out for him?
It's just, I think he could go as high as 9 to the Bears. And it's just, you're not getting ahead of the Bears. I don't think it happens. I don't think they're willing to give up enough. And I also just don't think the teams that head of the Bears are going to want to move down, really. Especially like Falcons, I think, want to stick and pick. You could look at the Raiders if they don't want to draft a quarterback, but I think they should just stick and play pick the best defensive player. So they're probably out. If he goes at 9, obviously you're out of it. I think if he were, I think the farthest he could fall is maybe to the Patriots. And even then, I feel like that's probably asking a lot. I think that him and Broderick Jones might be gone by the Patriots pick. So,
yeah, you got to get ahead of somebody there. But in terms of like boxes checked, Paris Johnson gets that dinner meeting. Broderick Jones not reported to have the dinner meeting, but Tomlin and Khan were there at his pro day as well as a few others. Clearly some interest there. And obviously he's a guy that falls at a position of need, checks a ton of boxes in terms of being a 96 percentile athlete. He's 21 years old, turns 22 shortly here after the draft. But just that guy, and they need it. And I know the Steelers haven't taken an offensive tackle in the first round in 26 years, but a little bit overdue, I would say, in today's passing league.
A little bit.
So definitely. And then we look in the second round, Shane, a guy like Dawan Jones, another box checker for the Steelers in terms of what Andy Weidel might be looking for in terms of size and length. I mean, we saw that with his history and with him, with the Eagles there, some of the guys that he targeted and worked with. And Dawan's a guy who got that dinner meeting as well, collectively with Paris Johnson. There was some interest prior to that. And so that's another guy that's on the map, maybe early second round, one of their second round picks. So I think that any chance that tackle's not addressed until the third round or later?
I think that with the Steelers, it's hard to say. I like to think that it won't happen, but I think if the right things happen around them where the tackle just doesn't fit the value at either of their first two picks, I think it's possible it just doesn't get addressed maybe at all, or if it is addressed, it's going to be like 120 and like a flyer player or something like that. Like,
yeah.
And I think it's unlikely that both 17 and 32 are spots that you just cannot justify taking a tackle that's left. But I'm not going to rule it out because, again, a lot of these guys I think are going to get pushed up because the tackle class is not necessarily super deep, in my opinion. There's like 6 or 7 guys I think are legitimately like top 40-ish players, you could argue. After that, though, it really kind of falls off a cliff in terms of guys who can play right now. You can maybe develop some of these guys later on, but if you want help day one, you're not getting it if you're not taking a guy at the first 2 picks. So I think if those guys have gone and they don't address at 17 and they get to 32 and the best guy left is like, Bergeron, a lot of people like him. I don't know if he's a day one player though, if you want to like start him immediately. If he's the best one left, it's probably not going to be him at 32. So you might have to address something else. So it's going to really just be based on how the board falls to them. And that's kind of any draft, but especially tackle this year. I think it has a potential at least for it to not fall their way.
Yeah, definitely. I could see that happening. I could see a run on tackle. It's obviously a very important position. The Steelers have a pre-draft visit with Anton Harrison. And so that's another guy from Oklahoma we could put on the map. I was very bummed to see that no Darnell Wright, at least not yet.
Yeah.
And so, and not even much interest at his pro day, just one area scout out there at Tennessee. He's a guy I think that would have been a plug and play right tackle. And I think would have been an improvement over a core for. I know there's some mixed reviews on him. I love the tape. I think the tape stepped up so much this year. He's a 21-year-old senior. He played in the SEC. He had the best game I've ever seen against Will Anderson. And so a lot to like about him, except again, I wonder how much that arm length threshold really maybe bothers Andy Weidel because he missed on an Andre Dillard in the past. And so having the 33 and 3/4 inch arms isn't the same as the guy that has the 36 or the 35-inch arms. And so we'll see if that ends up ultimately playing a factor in their evaluation process, but just something to note there.
Yeah, I'm going to bring this up here real quick because it's related. So what pick could Paris Johnson fall to from Christopher Elmer here? We have another question from him we'll address a little bit later, but what pick could Paris Johnson fall to where you'd feel comfortable sending draft capital to move up to get him? I mean, I'd feel good about it if he falls anywhere past like 11 or 12. Like if the Jets are coming up and he's still on the board, I'd want to get in front of them for sure, because I think they'll take him for sure if he's there at 13. I think they'll take whatever tackle's left at 13 if they still have that pick, which I do think that Rodgers is not going to go for that pick. I think they're going to have that. So they're going to address offensive tackle if they can to help him out. So you kind of need to get above them, I think, for sure, if you want to get one of the 3 guys. But teams know that, and they might kind of make them pay more than they're willing to pay, in my opinion. So we'll see.
I agree. I think 12 is like the bare bones lowest you can go to either get Paris or Broderick because I think that if there is a tackle left at that point, the Jets are almost certain to wipe out that last guy of that top tier right there. Great question, Christopher. And again, is it worth doing? It's hard to say. I mean, it all comes down to, the Steelers were willing to trade a first, a second, and a future third to go up and get a linebacker in Devin Bush to jump into the top 10.
Yeah.
That obviously, hindsight being what it is, was not worth it. And there's a lot of studies now that prove that taking off ball linebackers aren't worth it in the first round. For a player that could be potentially a 10-year left tackle like Paris Johnson, I think there's certainly an argument to be made that, man, if it only cost me pick 17 and pick 49, why not go ahead and do something like that? You can always trade back from 32, Shane, and try to get back some of that capital that you lost with a trade up. It just depends on how the Steelers view these tackles. They're not like the tackle class that had like Tristan Wirfs and Jedrick Wills and Andrew Thomas. They're a little bit lower than those guys, a
Yeah,
step
maybe
lower
like
than
a
those guys, but
step
it's still
lower, but
they're
yeah.
still good though. They're still good
Yeah.
tackles with lots of upside. Like I love the upside of both Paris Johnson and Broderick Jones. I think that they could both be good tackles for a long time. So definitely an interesting question there. Let's go to cornerbacks now, Shane. This is the other one. It's like tackle and cornerback. Everybody mocking to the Steelers. It's got to be either a tackle or a cornerback. That's the way it seems. And there's good reason for that because the Steelers have looked at a lot of tackles. Now, what's interesting, Shane, though, is when it comes to cornerback visits, like no interest in Christian Gonzalez. Probably they know that he's going to be long gone anyway. And Gonzalez was my QB or my CB1 from the beginning. Love that guy. I think that he's pretty much the flawless cornerback prospect. I have him a little bit under, like he's not the Patrick Surtain too, but he's a step under that guy. But man, he's a guy that deserves to go in like a top 8 pick. Won't be gone. And so I think that can attribute to why the Steelers haven't shown much interest in him. Interesting that low. Devin Witherspoon doesn't seem to be a ton of interest there. Didn't have only one representative at Deontay Banks' pro day before they brought him in for a visit. So technically still checks that box. Porter is the one, obviously, and no secret. I mean, this is, if we are to say that a guy is like last year's version of Kenny Pickett or the year before's version of Najee Harris, it's Joey Porter, right? I mean, this is a guy that's been mocked since like September to the Steelers to say, oh, there's the family bloodlines, there's a connection, there's a position of need. He checks the boxes that Pittsburgh looks for. So they don't dip their toes in that water very often in terms of drafting cornerbacks in the first round, but that could change this year. So what are your thoughts on all that?
I think that corner at 17 is still probably what I think they're going to do if you had to ask me today. And I think it's because of the fact that the offensive tackles that they've shown the most interest in either not going to be there at 17 or probably are too rich at 17 for them, right? So there's that combination of those two things, right? So corner might be the sweet spot, but it comes down to who's going to be there. And I kind of want to move to the chat we got earlier from Cash Rollins here about who are your top 3 cornerbacks that the Steelers could draft with 17. I think the ones that could be there, obviously Joe Porter Jr. is number 1. He's the guy that I think is 1 they would draft, and 2 I would draft as well. I know that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, Deontay Banks, for you, not exactly the best pick at 17, but I think that is also very possible because, again, for me at least, I have to go back through and watch these guys again before the draft actually happens at this point. But I have similar grades on those 2 players, it just for different reasons, right? They're not identical players by any means, but I think they're similar levels of player right now. So I think that still would make some sense, and he's likely going to be there. And then the third guy, maybe a Cam Smith, but again, at 17, that's too rich. I think he's more of a late first, early second round player, but I think he'd probably be their favorite after them. So it really just, again, I think it comes down to who goes early, because I think definitely Witherspoon and Gonzalez will be gone. It's whether or not Porter's going to be gone as well or not, honestly.
Yeah, it's certainly looking that way. And is like, I don't think there's any chance that Witherspoon's going to be there. Gonzalez for sure gone. So. Witherspoon, it makes, and again, the film says no, he should not be there. But when you're talking about a 180-pound cornerback with short arms who didn't do any testing, who's been injured this offseason, you never know what can happen. So I don't like to say never in terms of draft stuff. But so if you're asking that question, Cash, I would say my top 3 cornerbacks are Gonzalez, Witherspoon, and Porter. Who should the Steelers target, or who could they target in the first round? To me, it should be Porter or nobody, because
at 17, especially.
At 17, because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But man, it is a good cornerback class, a really, really good cornerback class in like the first 50 to 70 picks here. And I just don't see the difference being big enough between a Deontay Banks and a Cam Smith to take that guy at 17. Like, in fact, I'm actually a bigger Cam Smith fan than I am a Deontay Banks fan. You go back and put on Cam Smith's film from 2021. It was excellent. Took a step back this year. And I think there's a case to be made when we talk about that next group of Banks, Cam Smith, even throw like Keely Ringo in there because of what he did in 2022. And then Forbes, depending on what you think of his weight and whether or not he's going to be able to, with an NFL weight program, get up to the 175, 185 range. So there's definitely some guys in there, and I know how you feel about that, but it's we're not talking about a slam dunk pick. I'm going to talk more about Banks when we get down to that list here. So let's move on for now, Shane. We'll kind of get through these last couple real quick here. Interior defensive line. There's obviously some interest here. I don't know if there's enough to take a guy in the first round, and realistically, there's, in my mind, Shane, there's one guy that has a true first round grade in the interior defensive line. That's Jalen Carter. obviously comes with a variety of off the field issues that I don't know that the Steelers would want to get mixed up in, even if he fell that far, which I don't believe he's going to anyway. But that's my true first round grade this year. Everybody else is going to have a second round grade for me. And we'll talk about another name on that list as well. But there's still interest here on the part of the Steelers. They were at Brian Brazee's pro day at Clemson. They were at Mozzie Smith's pro day. He had a dinner meeting with Tomlin and Khan. There's like the Gervin Dexters, the Keanu Bettons that they brought in for visits. And so definitely, I think we're looking at either like possibly 32, pick 49, somewhere in that range. Certainly defensive line is on the table.
Yeah, and I still think, and I'm going to talk more about the interior defensive line, obviously, since that's where we're at. But I think these three positions we've talked about so far are the most likely three positions that get drafted at 17, 32, 49. That still feels like it's probably going to be these three positions. It could be another position in there. We'll talk about another one that maybe be a fit at 49 or something around there. But I want them to get one of the guys that you talked about other than Carter, especially. Like, I think that Brazee is probably gone by 32, but he's too early. I think it's too early at 17. We'll talk about that as well, too, later on. I think, for me, Benton is my second interior player at this point. I have a first and second on him. I think that he's legitimately, day one, he's a great nose tackle. I think, and not that long from then, I could see him being an above average pass rusher as well from the interior too. So he's kind of my number two. I don't dislike Mozzie Smith. I think his tape is hot and cold. I've seen a lot of Michigan, obviously being a Big Ten fan with Wisconsin. I've seen a lot of him play. I still think he's probably a second round value. That's fine, but I don't know 32. I think more of him at 49, but he's probably gone by then. And Dexter's the wild card for me because I really like everything about his profile. The tape is a little bit on and off, right? And with an interior defensive lineman, that happens, especially in college. They rotate a lot. Sometimes they don't always put all their full effort in, it feels like. So it's kind of hard to know with him, but his athletic profile is crazy. It's awesome. And I think a good fit for what we're trying to do. So any of those guys, though, if you can get them at, between 32 and 49, I'm not going to be upset about it.
Yeah, I think that's where the value lies when it comes to the interior defensive line. Yeah. Andrew's comment made me laugh here. Running back round one, book it. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean,
Bijan, come on down, 17. Him and Harris will have 600 carries between them each year. Yeah.
I think I agree with you there, though. I think that's where the value is going to fall on the defensive line there. Edge defender. Shayne, I want to throw this out here.
Yeah. Okay.
There is nobody talking about edge right now, and I am not going to say that it's not a possibility at 17. I'm not going to say that.
This class is so good. It's so good at edge, too.
The edge class is so good. And if we look at the players the Steelers have met, not only had a pro day meeting with, but some of them have had the pro day dinner meeting. And in addition to other meetings, combine meeting as well. So we're looking at Miles Murphy, Will McDonald, Nolan Smith, and Lucas Van Ness. Those are four guys projected to go right smack dab, like in the middle of the first round. And I think it's possible that the Steelers say, all right, the guys we are targeting, maybe we are targeting a Broderick Jones or a Joey Porter. Those guys are wiped off the board. We're going to go with the best edge guy. And I wouldn't be thrown through a loop. I'm preparing myself right now for it because I don't think you do these dinner meetings with those guys and four edge players that are projected to go right where you are picking unless you are actually serious about that. Now, again, everybody's going to say, yes, the Steelers have TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith under contract. They do at the moment. Highsmith, we don't know what's happening with him. The guy could go and make $17 to $20 million a year next year in free agency if he has another good season. And the Steelers won't be able to do a thing about it and probably shouldn't do a thing about it because they're already spending too much money on the defensive side of the ball in comparison. So I think maybe, and again, looking ahead is never something that Kevin Colbert did. I'm living in the moment. I'm drafting a team that's going to help me win right now. Yeah. Maybe under Khan and Weidel, maybe that philosophy shifts a little bit and we're saying, hey, we're going to prepare ourselves a little bit. We don't want TJ Watt if TJ Watt were to go down for the season again, our team's in big trouble. And so, and not only that, Shayne, but I do think that there's a strong case to be made that one of these edge players is the best player on the overall player on the board. Maybe not the most important position, but the best overall player on the board when the Steelers are on the clock at 17.
Yeah. Before I dive into kind of my thoughts on it, I just want to throw this up here. We definitely should, I think, if the money's right, we should sign Dupree for depth. But Dupree on the market right now. He did meet with us, I think. And then Andrew chimes in here with him being maybe an after the draft thing. I think that's probably what it would be, is if they don't address edge,
most likely
be what it is. But moving away from that situation, I think that all we have to do, right, to rationalize why this could be possible is look across the state and look at what the Eagles have done. Their edge group was unbelievable. Not just the starters, but the depth was better than a lot of team starters. That's just
Oh, yeah.
what it is. And there's a reason why they had 70 something sacks in the regular season. There's a reason why their defense was so good in the back. And those corners are great, but when you have that edge rush up front, of course you're not going to be able to pass the football. I mean, there's just no way. And I think that that's something that people need to understand is like, you're not just drafting starters day one when you draft edge. Like, you're drafting guys who can come in and help with the edge depth. They can come in and replace a starter if somebody leaves, like Highsmith again. He's probably, if he repeats his season he had this past year, he's going to get $18 to $20 million from some team if they want to pay him that. And the Steelers, I don't think they're going to pay edge rushers $50 million a year combined. I just don't think they're going to do it. I don't really think you should either. So it's not something that we have to just that we can just dismiss, especially like you said, if offensive tackle, if the value's not there at 17, if corner the value's not there at 17, if edge is the best position left on the board value-wise, I will not be surprised if they take him, whether it's Nolan Smith, which would be a little bit of a different profile than what we normally go for, or Van Ness or whoever it is. I think that that's more of a possibility than we might think it is, especially with how I see the board falling for them possibly.
Yeah, and those are all good players. I mean, don't get it construed with what it actually is. And I know what's going to happen if something were like that were to happen, Shane. There might be an uproar at the beginning.
Yeah,
people be like, "Why'd they do this? They need a corner. They need the tackle. They need whatever else."
And they're right.
I think they do, and they do need those things. Now, I think the draft should be about taking the best players at the most important positions.
Ideally,
if your best tackles and your best corners are gone, those are money positions as well. But if those guys are gone and you have a higher grade on this edge defender, and you know that you're going to be losing Highsmith, I mean, I'm not opposed to doing something like that. Now, the other thing, again, like we said, the depth was horrendous. Like Malik Reed might have been the worst edge piece, the worst third edge in the whole sport. And I'm not trying to harp on the guy, but again, you have to have something better there. The good teams have 2 full rotations. They do. And they keep their guys a lot fresher than what the Steelers have kept Highsmith and Watt. And they probably need to understand that at this point, you shouldn't be overworking your defensive player of the year. You need to get the guy a break. You need to put other guys out there. As much as Watt obviously wants to be on the field, you have to do what's best for your team. And you don't want the guys to be completely exhausted when they get in the playoffs either, if they get in the playoffs. So just something to consider there. Don't throw it out yet, because it's a possibility. If the chips don't fall their way and the positions they really want are gone there, they have interest in 4 of these guys in the first round. So keep that in mind. All right. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, you can do so by subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all your support, and thanks for all of you who are chiming in with your questions today. We love it. We love getting that interaction here. All right, Shane, I did my list, my dreaded top 5 players that we do not want the Steelers to draft at pick 17 list. I'm going to go through these. I'm going to share my thoughts. I'm going to get your rebuttal, and I want to see if you agree, disagree with me on some of these. And I would like to hear your reasoning as well, and I'm sure the listeners would too. But for this list, what I did is I basically went with players that are very, very much on the Steelers' radar in terms of visits and interest that we have seen so far. And I tried to exclude guys that are clearly going to be gone before their pick, or a very good chance there's going to be gone before their pick. Obviously, we mentioned Broderick before. I'm a big Broderick fan, so no, he's not on the list. You don't have to worry about him being on there. But let's kick it off, Shane, with my number 5 player on this list. We're going to go backwards order to build up the anticipation, because I know that you all are going to stick around to the very end of the show. We crank on over an hour here.
You should.
Number 5 on the list, Shane, Brian Brazee. And we talked about him just a little bit on today's episode. Clemson guy. If you watch a Brian Brazee highlight tape, you are going to come away impressed.
Yeah.
There's no way you can't, because this guy at 6'5.5", 300 pounds, he can get to the quarterback like that. I mean, it's instant. So the flashes are as good as you will see. The problem is this guy is just not there yet. He's just not consistent. I know he's a fresh 21-year-old here. He missed some time. I like Brazee's upside. I like what he could be. There's just some things that really concern me here. The arm length isn't a big deal to me in terms of interior guys as it is for edge players. So he does have arms. They're on the shorter side despite his tall frame. It's not like you're getting Cam Hayward or Stephon Tuitt with 34 plus arms. You're getting a guy with like 32.5-inch arms. That's okay. I can live with that if the prospect's good enough. I think the flashes are so high, but you know what he really reminds me of is Taven Bryan coming out of Florida. He's so much like Taven Bryan. And even if you compare like athletic traits, size, height, weight, arm length, all that kind of stuff. They were both had extremely underwhelming college production as well. And yet, as high as the flashes were, and you can see all the traits on film, I just don't know if it's not guaranteed to translate over. And so to me, I've got a second round grade on Brian Brazee. I think where you start considering him is around the pick 32 range. If he's available, somebody might jump on the upside before that. And I understand that. It's going to come down to how much do you trust your defensive line coach to coach this guy up? Because I think that Brazee is a guy that would be probably a much better player on Dallas than he would be in Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, I think he's going to be one of those guys where maybe a little bit scheme dependent. You get him in some stunts and stuff. Man, the guy can fly for a player his size, and he can get after the quarterback in a hurry. He's not all there as a run defender, and he's very inconsistent still as a pass rusher. And so I think that 17 is too rich for me. He's a guy that I would target. I can start considering at that 32 pick, depending on who's on the board. And obviously, Brazee, there's a good chance that he'd be gone by then. I know he's higher than that on the consensus board. And the consensus has him generally right around where Steelers are. He might be like 19th right now. Steelers are picking 17. Just too high for me, Shane. I want to get your thoughts on Brazee.
I think you kind of hit it on the head with the idea that it's not so much that he isn't a good prospect. It's that you don't know enough about him as a player at this point between injuries and consistency. The flashes are great, like you said. He's not a complete player. And so you're drafting a guy that you have to make some projection with. And that's the case with every player, right? But him especially, I think, among a lot of the guys who are in that top 20, 25-ish prospect rankings, he, to me, is one of the guys that probably has the least, I have the least confidence in being a NFL starting caliber player, right? It's just there's a lot you haven't seen from him or that you want to see from him that he didn't really show in college. And you could point to a lot of things, like obviously he had injuries. He had this situation with his sister, which obviously is terrible. And, I don't know how much that really affected him on the field. Obviously, we'll never really know that. But there's things you can point at and go, well, I think because of these things, maybe he will be better pro than a college player. But you just don't really know. And I think at 17, it's just too early for really any team. I think late 20s, early 30s, I think that's his draft range. I think he does get drafted later than consensus has him, just because there's players that are more refined than him at other positions that are also important. But again, if you look at him at 32, I think that's a good time to take a chance on a guy with his athletic upside. I mean, he is athletic. That's the takeaway from watching him. You look at the drills, he looks fluid, he looks great. Again, is he going to be able to contribute in the first year or even the first 2 years? It's not a guarantee. And if he ends up Taven Bryan, he's a rotational, guy that can come in and rush the passer a little bit, but that's it. And it's not obviously worth even a top 32 pick, let alone 17. So,
yeah. And I would certainly hope that he becomes a better NFL player than that guy. Right. And we're projecting this guy forward because the upside is so immense now. Yeah. And when I went back and watched Shane, I watched Jalen Carter's pro day and I watched Brazee's pro day back to back. My goodness, is there a massive difference in just in terms of speed, agility, athletic traits between those two guys? And Carter's the better prospect. He's the better player.
Oh yeah, and he's obviously dealing with a lot of stuff too. So it's
my goodness, and he came in late. He came in sloppy.
Yeah, it was bad. Yeah,
the decision to take the shirt off. I don't know about that. I mean,
that whole process is tough for him. But yeah,
Brazee, the upside is through the roof. I'm not there yet, and I think that he's your prototypical boom or bust prospect. Like he could be. Yeah. He could be a Pro Bowl level defensive tackle. He could be a guy that you want as a backup in your rotation just because he is so inconsistent from play to play and in game to game. So that's a guy that I can get on board with at 32, too rich for 17. Number 4 on my list of players the Steelers should not draft at pick 17 is fellow Clemson player and linebacker Trenton Simpson. I like Simpson, Shane. Don't get me wrong. Okay. I do have a thing against drafting off-ball linebackers in the first round unless you are an elite prospect. And what I mean by that is, like, if you are, let's say, Micah Parsons, and I can know that I can get something more out of you than that, and Dallas certainly has. Now, if Parsons was just a linebacker for Dallas, he wouldn't be nearly as valuable. He's valuable because he's one of the best edge rushers in the
he is, yeah.
Yes. And Simpson's not that guy. Now, Simpson is very versatile. He reminds me a lot of Fred Warner in terms of the things that he can do. He can cover a guy straight down the seam. He can split out and he can blitz. He can do a lot of things. He's young. He's athletic. I'm not a supporter of taking linebackers in the first round. I think the evidence supports that. If you look over the last decade of linebackers that have been drafted in the first round, it's not a very promising list at all. And in fact, it's very much like the history when it comes to drafting running backs in the first round, where you can look in, there's actually the best linebackers in the league right now, Shane, are second and third round picks. They're not first round picks. And I think what it shows is that the position isn't as valuable as it has been in the past. There was a day and age where, I mean, you couldn't get a good enough linebacker. Even like the Luke Kuechly generation, it's like that guy is a huge difference maker.
Yeah.
There's so much quick passing game and everything right now that you can kind of take linebackers out of the game a little bit.
More than ever.
I don't think that Simpson is that level of prospect to me, like the can't miss, like Ryan. He's not Ryan Shazier. He's got some Shazier like traits, but he's a step down from that guy, where I had Shazier and Mosley as first round grades in that 2014 class. Simpson's not quite there. He's a little bit more inconsistent. Those guys a little bit more raw. And another reason, Shane, that I don't want Simpson at pick 17 is I like the first 4 linebackers in this class. That's when the tier falls off after that. And so you have Trenton Simpson, you've got Jack Campbell, you got Drew Sanders, and you got Deion Henley. And all those guys have really good tape, or at least they have the flashes on tape. They've got the athleticism that you need, at least the threshold. Jack Campbell's not as athletic on tape, but is a good overall athlete. If I can get one of those 4 guys, I'm content. I don't need to take one in the first round if I'm taking a non-premium position. Now, would he be better than what Steelers have? Obviously, because what they had was not very good at all. That's a low bar to clear. I shouldn't use that as the reason to try to take a linebacker in the middle of the first round. I'm saving that for those guys that are elite prospects and you are checking every box and you have A+ tape. That's when I would consider taking that off the ball guy in the first round. Simpson, to me, is a guy that should be in play at pick 32, not 17. What are your thoughts?
So I think in general, I agree with the whole idea of just not taking a linebacker in the first round unless they are a generational player. Like if there's someone who pretty much has shown every attribute you want to see from a linebacker at a high level already in college, then I understand it. But some of the guys who've come out that haven't really worked out, like obviously we have Devin Bush, really great athlete, didn't work out in the NFL for a host of reasons. Even Devin White for the Bucks, he's had a lot of production. Is he a good linebacker, in my opinion, at this point? I don't think so. He doesn't cover anybody. There's literally, I don't think there's one position he can cover. And I worry a little bit with Simpson that he's going to have that problem because he's a great athlete. But I went back and watched more of him after they went to the Clemson's pro day because of all the guys that are at Clemson defensively. And I think he has all the tools to cover people. I don't think he covers people right now. I don't think he has the coverage skills day one to come in and fill that role reliably. He's someone you hope will do it at some point, and he'll be able to get by with his athleticism in terms of being able to run guys down in the run game, being able to blitz, doing all that stuff. That he'll be able to do that. But is he going to be a true cover player early on? I don't think so. And then you have to develop him. And we haven't shown that we can develop guys to be able to cover people. So, athletic tools or not. I think that linebacker, to me, I don't know if I take any of these guys for the Steelers specifically, just based on where the value is, until 49. 32, if it's like Campbell or Sanders, those two I think are probably Sanders for the upside, Campbell for the what you're going to get aspect of it. I get
that.
I'm looking more at 49, like a Henley, who his athleticism and his tape is better than Simpson's in coverage already, even though he hasn't played linebacker as long. So I would rather take a chance on a guy like that, who I think has a better chance of being able to help day one and also has all the athletic tools you want to see too. So Simpson for 17, absolutely not. 32, even then I like guys more than him, 32. So.
Yep, I totally get that mentality. And like I said, I think 49 might even be the sweet spot because if I can get one of those top 4 guys that I like, so. and even if the 4th guy is on the board, there's not a big enough difference for me to say, let's take one at 17 compared to all the way at 49. And I can use those top 2 picks on premium positions. Let's pull up an Eric question for us real quick, if you could, Shane.
Yeah.
Best player available. Who's going to be the best player available at 17, regardless of position? Great question. I think, Shane, in my opinion, I think that the tackles that we've talked about, Paris Johnson, Broderick Jones, will be gone. I think that Joey Porter is likely to go, even if it's just one pick before the Steelers, because even the Commanders need a great cornerback. I think you can make the case that a guy like maybe Lucas Van Ness might be the best player on the board at that spot. A versatile defensive lineman, a guy that can play 4-eye, 5 tech. He can play, come in and be a 3 tech on third downs. He can be an edge player. I think there's a ton of value in that guy. And even at 272 pounds, that guy plays so strong. I think that based on how my board is probably going to lay out, I'd say maybe a guy like that, maybe a guy like Nolan Smith, somebody, and that goes back to the edge discussion. Again, it might not be the position we want the Steelers to draft, but I certainly would have those guys over like the next tier of cornerbacks if the Steelers miss out on those.
Yeah, I think in general, like, should we go best player available at 17, regardless of position? I think that in general, that's the right strategy to have across the NFL. I think that unless you have a need that is so glaring that like you literally won't be able to function as a team without that position being filled, you pretty much should go best player available 90% of the time. And I think for the Steelers, that is why the question of edge comes up, like you said, because I feel like if you're looking just purely at where these guys would rank among the rest of the class, edge is probably going to be the best position left at 17. It's very likely that it could be.
It's likely. Yeah.
And now the question then is the difference between your edge 4 and your tackle 4 and your corner 4 big enough that you would supersede the need and take the better player? That becomes the question that the Steelers only can really answer, right? Because we don't know at this point how they're ranking these guys. So I think that they should do that in general, but I don't know if they will necessarily either. So
yep, I definitely get that. Good question there. Drew Sanders over Simpson all day. Andrew says, I would agree with that as well. I think I love the upside of Sanders, and I think that the tape is probably even a little bit further along, even though he's only had one full year at that position. I kind of like what he's got going on there. Let's look at the next guy here, Shane, and that's number 3 on my list. That is defensive back. Let's call him a defensive back, safety, nickel corner, whatever you want to call him. Brian Branch. Now, listen, this one might upset some people. Branch is a good player. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I just think that you shouldn't value this role this highly in the NFL draft. As good of a prospect as he is. The Steelers just lost this guy in Cameron Sutton. They lost a guy. Now, I think Branch is a lot better in like the run support stuff than what Sutton is. But if you're talking about a guy that can cover the slot,
coming out,
I feel like how valuable is that to you? Should I be taking a slot cornerback in the middle of the first round? Because to me, I want a guy that's going to be a premier outside lockdown corner if I'm taking one in the first anyway, and especially middle of the first. I know a lot of people are really high on Branch. I think that Branch should be more towards like the late 20s, early 30s range. That's kind of view him as a prospect, even going back and watching the tape. Like I think his tape is good. It's not A+ tape. He's not Minka. He's not Derwin. I said that on a different pod before. In order for me to take you as a safety prospect or a guy that can cover nickel, you have to be a tier higher than how I view Branch. And again, if we look at Branch's production, like the TFL stuff that's great. You've got the Mike Hilton checkbox covered there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
When we're talking about a guy in coverage, I think he's good there. And I think that he could be potentially an upgrade down the line over Steelers, what they've had at that position, covering in nickel and dime. He also has 2 career interceptions. And it's something like, if he's not checking enough boxes, at some point we just got to say the guy's a second round prospect. Like you got 2 picks in 3 years. I know you're at a high level competition, but I want to see a little bit more than that. You do not have elite size metrics at all, especially if I'm viewing you as a safety at 5'11", 190 pounds. It's pretty small for safety and he's got short arms to boot. And he has 4.58 speed. Now, again, if it's just 1 or 2 of these things, it's the collection of everything with Branch where he's just falling short of a lot of these thresholds that I look for. And this is why you should kind of look for some of these check boxes, because there's a little bit more risk involved when you start ignoring and saying, oh, it's okay that he's short. It's okay he's got short arms. It's okay that he doesn't have ball production, that he doesn't take the ball away. It's okay that he's slow. At some point, we have to say, all right, because of what we just said right there, that makes him a guy who probably should be drafted on day 2. That's my view on Branch. I know that some people are much higher, like even as close as like top 12 or 15 picks. I'm not there with him at all.
So for me, this is the first guy where I go, okay, the problem with it, right, is I know what would happen if this happened. So because of the value and because like what you said, the metrics with him, the athleticism, it doesn't really flash to you, right? And even the tape, like he's a really good player on tape, and I think he is a really good player. I have to say that. I think that the problem with this pick is that if the Steelers took him at 17 on draft day, I would be complaining about it, but he'd probably be really good. So it would become one of those situations where like you kind of forget that the value of the draft is not just about getting great players, it's about getting great players at the right spot for their value. So Branch at 32, or he won't make it anywhere near 49, but if he's in that end of the first, early second range, he's good value at that point. At 17, though, regardless of how good he is or isn't in the NFL, it probably wasn't the best use of resources, right? And this is where you get into that conversation. So for me, would he be really good for the Steelers? Probably. Do I want to take him at 17 though to find out? No. I think that's kind of the end all be all of it. So
I think that's a good summary, basically, of who Brian Branch is, and I feel the same way about that, Shane. I think that he would be a good player. That's not where I have the questions.
exactly.
Would he be an elite player? I don't view him as
Probably
that.
not. Probably not.
But then again, we look at like the safety market this year. How many first-round safeties were thrown back into the free agent market and went for pennies? I mean,
it just is what it is. Yeah.
It's just not that valuable of a position. And again, I go back to it. Unless you have a Minka Fitzpatrick or an Earl Thomas or someone like that, I think that you it kind of should be like some of the other non-premium positions where you should kind of draft and replace and repeat the process, or find the veterans in free agency, like a lot of teams did this offseason, and save that elite capital on the positions that are a little bit more impactful for your team. And we look at in terms of like WAR, like the PFF stat, WAR wins above replacement. You say what you want about PFF, they have it charted. In their view, safeties just aren't very valuable. And I can understand why, because unless you have like a true like ball hawk difference making safety, and again, we want to say Branch's ball hawk, he's got 2 picks. So obviously the turnovers aren't always translatable from year to year. He could go in his rookie season, have 3 or 4 picks. It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah. But we have to go off of what we know. And again, I think he falls short of some of those first round check boxes that I like to see. So Branch is a name on my list that I do not want the Steelers to draft at 17. I would be a little bit upset with that. I would feel confident that he'd be getting a very solid football player who can play the strong safety role, who can blitz, who can cover the slot. But is that worth the 17th pick? I think that's where I would draw the line.
Yeah.
Let's go to number 2, Shane, and the guy we've talked about a couple times already on this episode, Deontay Banks. Now, I won't take too long with him because we've talked about him a little bit already. But I do want to say with Banks, there are some things that scare me a little bit. I've heard rumors that his maturity is not all there. Didn't score very well on the Wonderlic. He's 23 years old, which again, it's a collection of when we put it all together. So he's 23 years old. He's a 1-year wonder, really. I mean, this was his first good season. And even if you go back and watch his tape from this year, Shane, which I've watched on the All 22, it's very up and down. It's not tape that's going to wow you all the time. He's going to bite sometimes. He's going to miss sometimes. The athletic traits are obviously great. I mean, he meets the size threshold, 6 foot, like 197. That's great. Length is good enough. It's in like the 40 some percentile, I believe. Yeah. So that's fine. Checks the box at least. Again, we talk about ball production. This guy had 2 interceptions in 4 years in college. And you're talking about taking a cornerback in the first round. Where do you draw the line, Shane, and say this is no longer a first round caliber prospect? Is it the age? Is it the very limited ball production when he's been playing? Now, to be fair, he doesn't have all that many snaps. Like this past year, he had most of his snaps. But again, you wonder why it takes a player so long to make that college impact the way that it does. And just from some of the insider stuff that I've been hearing a little bit from Banks, I'm a little bit turned off from him at pick 17. He's a guy, like I said before, I like much better at the 32 range. Probably won't be there. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that, Shane, because I'm probably going to have Cam Smith a little bit higher on my board. I think he had better ball production. He was doing it in the SEC level. If you compare Cam Smith's 2021 tape compared to Banks's 2022 tape, there's no comparison that Cam Smith was a better football player. So in my mind, at least. So I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, go back and put on some Cam Smith. This year was not so good. And I think he got dinged in terms of his grade and everything else because he did lead the nation at his position in penalties, which is not good. Yeah, he's a very aggressive football player.
He's grabby.
Yeah. Very, very grabby. We'll see what he gets away with in the NFL. But I'm a Cam Smith fan. I'm an Emmanuel Forbes fan. Regardless of the weight, if the guy can put on a little bit more. Even like Akili Ringo, there's Tyreek Stevenson. There's a bunch of guys that I can get behind with either the 32nd or the 49th pick. I don't feel like Banks is that much better than these prospects that I should be taking him with the 17th pick when I know that he's not going to be the best player on my board at that time. That's my thoughts. What are your thoughts on Banks?
So I do view him a little bit more favorably. I think the question for me, like you said, is the consistency. He didn't play a lot, and he wasn't inconsistent in his 1 year of full-time play. To me, I think him and Porter Jr. are very different players, but I don't grade them that dissimilarly, mostly because I think Joey's going to be a press man corner day one who can do that role for you. I think that Banks is probably stickier in man coverage across the field. He has more of the athletic tools to be able to run with guys. He does have enough size to be able to get up in the face of some of these big receivers and deal with them. like you said, though, the concern for him mostly is why did he not really play much until this year?
Mhm.
The tape, he doesn't have a lot of ball production. Neither does Joey. So like those two both have that ding on them as far as ball production goes. I don't care as much about that at the NFL level because again, interceptions are so iffy year to
They
year,
are.
and a
They're
lot of the
random.
time, a lot of the time it's more about being in the right place. Just ask Minka; he's always in the right place. Now that's a skill in its own, but that's still besides
Mhm.
the point. But I don't care as much about that, especially because more so with Joey, because again, he's so long that he's going to get his hands on balls a lot. It might not result in interceptions, but he's going to get a lot of passes deflected. I think that's just
Yes.
something that's going to be part of his game just because of his profile. So I wouldn't hate the pick at 17 as much, especially if there aren't a ton of other players that I have higher graded than him. But that is where the question comes in. I think that that's likely, though. I think there's going to be a lot of players that maybe not at the same position of needs that we have, but whether it's edge or whatever it may be, there's probably going to be better players at 17 than he is, though. So that's the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there certainly will be, at least on my board and probably even on the consensus board.
A
Now,
lot
don't
of
get me
boards, yeah.
wrong. This is not taking Artie Burns in the first round. This
No,
is
it's
not
it's
that level of pick.
very
This
different,
is a
very
great
different.
cornerback class. And so we're
Yeah.
still talking about a guy perhaps in a different year, even in that 2016 class. Maybe he's a guy that
Yeah,
actually deserves to go in the mid first round. But
right.
when I compare him to what's here, the cornerback class of
It's so
2023,
good. Yeah, it's
and,
such a
and
good
yeah, and the
class.
guys that are going to be available at pick 32 and even pick 49, this one, it becomes harder for me to get behind
Yeah,
Deontay Banks here
right.
because I do a little bit like Brazee. I feel like Banks is kind of a boomer bust prospect.
For
We've
sure.
seen one sample of decent play from him. And he's got the traits, but is he all there yet? I don't know. I would prefer to have that guy at pick 32. And if he's gone by pick 32, I like other
Yeah,
corners
it is
just
what
as
it
much,
is,
to be
yeah.
honest. So that's kind of my feeling about him. And number one name on the list, and we're going to wrap up this show here real soon, wide receiver Jordan Addison. I'm very I'm very sorry if this burst your bubble at all for those Pitt fans watching this, but I can't get behind Addison as a first round graded player at all. He comes far short of checking these boxes I want to see. I don't think he's the best receiver in the class. And again, if we compare it to last year's class, George Pickens was the 11th receiver taken. He was the 11th receiver taken in the class last year. And Pickens I think, is a better prospect. I had him 32 overall on my board last year. I think Pickens is a better prospect in a stronger class last year than Addison is in an incredibly weak wide receiver class. I am not a fan of this wide receiver class. I don't know if there's any that deserve to go in the first round. Maybe JSN, Jackson Smith and Jigba. In the back half, you're getting a solid yet unspectacular player. It's just, in my mind, Shane, you're looking at a 5'11 receiver at 170 pounds. That's a huge outlier in itself. Very short arms. I don't think he's twitchy and explosive after the catch. And if you're even looking for the guy as twitchy as Johnson, he's not that. I think he's destined to be probably a low end wide receiver too, who can do a lot of slot work for you. And I'm just not as big a fan as everybody else. And again, we're talking about a guy that played with 2 first round quarterbacks in Kenny Pickett and future first rounder Caleb Williams. And somehow he took a massive step back even last year. He was dealing with some injuries.
Yeah,
So I'll
for
give him a
sure.
little bit of grace there. But even the tape we saw, I don't think it was A+ tape. I think it was like B tape, B+ tape. I think he's a second round pick every day of the week. It so happens that this is a bad wide receiver class and he could go in the first round because it's not a very talented group this year. That's kind of my thoughts on Addison. Shane, I want to know how you feel on him.
So the first thing I'm going to say is just this has been my motto for this receiver class is if you need a receiver 2, you're probably good. If you need more than a
Yeah.
receiver 2, you're probably out of luck. I will say I'm very high on what I think JSN can be in the NFL because he's such a high floor player. And I think despite the questions about his speed, I think he does have the ability to play outside a little bit in certain schemes just because of his physicality
Mhm.
and his ability to just stack guys and jump over them basically despite him not being the biggest guy. But Addison to me probably for me at this point is going to be receiver 5. I would say I have to watch a couple more guys just to be sure, but I think he's going to be around that range. And it's mostly because there's guys that have better physical traits above him that I don't think are far off from him as a day one player and that push them a little bit ahead of him for that reason. Like my receiver 1 technically if you don't count JSN because again I do view him as more of a slot only player. Zay
Mhm.
Flowers is my receiver 1 because I think he's the only guy that showed he could win at all 3 levels in college. And it's not the same level of competition as some of the other guys showed, but again, he's the only one I think has the traits to kind of win at all 3 levels. All the other guys have major questions. Addison, the size, down size as well, even though I think those two are pretty comparable as players. Johnston plays like he's 5'10", so I don't know what you do with that. He's kind of a weird guy. Catching is iffy sometimes. There's a lot of questions with all these guys, like you said. I think Addison probably goes in the first round at some point because of the fact that teams need receivers and they're going to get pushed up because they need them. That's just kind of what it is, right? You see the contracts some of these guys are getting. Wide receiver 2 contracts are getting ridiculous, let alone wide receiver 1 contracts. Like, you need to find guys who can step in and play. I think Addison can do that. It's just, again, what is his ceiling? And you talked about it. Can he be a high-end wide receiver 2? Maybe. Is he more likely a mid to low-end wide receiver 2 / slot player? Probably. And that's great if you need it, but you don't want to take that definitely at 17 and maybe not even at 32, depending on your needs.
Yeah, my thought, Shane, is kind of just wait a year. Maybe wait a year. If you want to take one like 3rd, 4th round, if you need to, I'd take like a Jaden Reed. Like, I think you're getting 90%.
Yeah, you get a deep threat at least. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Christopher. I know that this is not what you wanted to hear from us, but I got to be honest. And again, I try to be as objective as possible with all my takes.
Yeah,
I would love for that Cinderella story, but I just think that he is a very okay player. I think he's going to be an okay starter in the NFL. I don't view him as a whole lot more than that.
No.
And that's just kind of my take on him. I think that if the Steelers are getting him, he's probably a guy that plays the slot for him this year. And maybe they try to play him at X receiver after Deontay Johnson, if they can get out of his contract or something.
I'd like to have him, like you said, but it's just,
I'd like to have him, just not the cost of
have to draft
17.
him. Yeah. You're not gonna be able to draft him at 17 or you can, but you shouldn't. And then 32, he'd probably gone. If he is there, there's still probably better players though at 32 than him, and that it's unfortunate because
there will be on my board for sure.
So
I know. So again, the Steelers need to improve their offense. And I understand that they average 18.1 points per game. It's got to take a step up. A receiver would certainly help in that regard. I just wish the receiver class was better. I wish it was like last year's class where you can get a Pickens in round 2, or I mean, even look at the first rounders last year, and Garrett Wilson and Drake London and Treylon Burks and Chris Olave and like all those guys. I'd have all those guys higher than I have Addison. And so just because he might be one of the, maybe one of the 3 best receivers in this year's class, it doesn't mean you should necessarily take him. He's not going to be as high on my board. He certainly won't be as valuable as some of the other positions that I'll have there and some of the other players that'll be available. All right. We went pretty long today. Thank you all for sticking with us. We're so glad that you chimed in the chat today, stuck with us throughout. Thank you for joining us on the Steel Curtain Podcast. You can follow us on YouTube. You can follow Shane on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can check out the Steel Curtain Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube and make sure to hit that subscribe button. And thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain Podcast.